The notes that I have posted contain the same information as the notes that are on eCampus, but I have changed the formatting to include subtitles and formatting behind the scenes so that someone who's using a screen reader can use them and interpret them. They don't have to visually see them. So the fonts are different, but the information on there is the same. Okay? So we're going to start here on the introduction to biological concepts. First question I have is, what is biology? Like when we see biological, and we're going to see a ton of big words in this class. Bio means what? Life. And ology means study of. So biology is study of life. So if you didn't know that, now you know that. And I would love to say that you're going to have test questions that are pretty straightforward, like the study of life is, but it's not like that. And it'll be like a long sentence, and then it'll say, what type of scientist would carry out this type of investigation? And if it has to do with living organisms, it's probably going to be a biologist, right? So making those connections. So biology is the study of life, and I'm super excited to hear that you said biology and study of life before me having to tell you that. So all living organisms have 7 characteristics. So that'll be what will be listed on the next the next few slides. The 7 characteristics. The first characteristic is that these organisms are organized into a hierarchy. Does anyone know what a hierarchy is? It's a list, okay? It's a list system. It does include the living organisms. It's like a structure or a ranking of organisms. So a hierarchy, okay? And the one thing that I want to put on this slide that I will come back to in just a moment is the term emergent properties. Emergent properties. You will need to be familiar with that, but I want you to understand it. I don't just want to speak on it and move on. I want to give you an example when I do. So, emergent properties. The second characteristic of living organisms is that they contain chemical information that flows, and we'll get to that term flow here shortly. But what chemical information do you and I carry that makes us unique? DNA. Yes, DNA. The third characteristic is that they engage in metabolic activities. And when I say metabolism, a lot of students are like, oh, you mean like digesting food? And 100% food digestion is a metabolic activity. But by definition, metabolism or a metabolic activity is just a chemical reaction. Okay? So we're going to look at that today as well, what a metabolism is. Before I move to the next slide and discuss the next 4, something I want to point out is if it's in blue, you can guarantee there's a test question or 2 directly associated with it. Okay? As you kind of fall through these notes, I'll guide you on this first chapter, and then you should see that same pattern every chapter. And the whole reason for my organization is to help you be successful. Okay? So if it's in blue, for sure. The fourth characteristic of a living system or a living organism is that energy flows through them, that they take in energy and they release energy. So they use energy. They take in energy and they release energy. Does anybody know what 3 letters you and I use to represent energy in biology? It's okay if you don't. ATP. ATP is our energy currency. Next quick lesson. If I ask you a question 9 times out of 10, the answer's right behind me. I never try to trick you. Unless I'm like, does anyone know? And then that's not really a trick. I'm just telling you the answer's not up there. But normally if I ask you a question, the answer's up there. Okay? So the energy currency that you and I use is ATP. We will have a whole lecture on ATP. The 5th characteristic is that we are able to remain constant inside regardless of what's happening on the outside. And we use this term homeostasis. How many of you have heard that term homeostasis before? Fantastic. Does anybody really have an idea what it means?
Maintain balance.
Balance where?
In the body.
In a living organism. It's an internal balance inside a living organism. It's an internal balance inside a living organism. Homeostasis. Some students mistakenly use the term equilibrium here as well. Equilibrium does not apply to a living organism. It applies to like a chemical solution. Okay? So when you see equilibrium and homeostasis, one deals with life and one deals with solutions and chemicals. Okay? We will use both in this course. I just want you to understand the difference, be able to distinguish them. So homeostasis. Sixth characteristic is that living organisms are able to reproduce and then develop and then reproduce. So the whole purpose of a living organism, what's their whole purpose in life? Reproduction, so that we can perpetuate that species. And when I say reproduce, though, most people initially go to sexual reproduction, which is 100% correct. Sexual reproduction is a form of reproduction, so is asexual. But we're reproducing right now. We're going through cellular reproduction, which means that our cells are reproducing to replace the ones that we're losing. Okay, and we call that mitosis. So you and I are going through that right now. Because you and I are eukaryotes. Does anyone know what a prokaryote is? It's a bacteria. The only thing on Earth that is prokaryotic is a bacteria. And they don't go through mitosis. They go through binary fission. That's how they reproduce. Okay, we will also discuss meiosis later in this semester. The seventh and final characteristic of a living system is their ability to evolve. And so we are going to talk about biological evolution today as well. So these last two slides have kind of served as like an introduction of what we're going to cover in this first section. Now, when I click here to the next slide, it has the first thing I mentioned, which was the hierarchy. So I have the notes organized so that you can match them. So here it is me introducing that term and that concept, and here I am going into more detail on it for you to enhance your understanding, okay? So you should see that pattern as we go through the notes, trying to link all that information. All right, so I'm just speaking on the first characteristic, which is the hierarchy of living systems. A cell is the basic unit of life. That's going to be one of the very first things that we discuss in this course. A cell is the basic unit of life. It's the smallest that life can be. Anything smaller than a cell, like an atom or an element, is not alive. A cell is the smallest unit of life. Now here's where that term emergent properties comes into play. When I put a bunch of cells together, guess what I get? Not yet. Eventually. Not yet. A tissue. We're going to put a bunch of cells together, and that'll give us a tissue. So a cell is alive, and it can function on its own. But when I put a bunch of cells together, they can do more. That's an emergent property. They have more characteristics when they're all together than they do when they are alone. Can a tissue do what a cell does? Yes, but can a cell do what a tissue does? No. That's an emergent property. Guess what happens when I put a bunch of tissue together? I create an organ. An organ is a bunch of tissues. So when I put a bunch of tissues together, it will function as an organ. Can an organ do what a tissue does? Yes, but can a tissue do what an organ does? No, because it's an emergent property. It came together to do more. You see where I'm going with this? Fantastic. When I put a bunch of organs together, guess what I make? Organ system. Organ system would be like your heart, blood vessels. That would be your cardiovascular system. Okay? Or your skin, hair, skin, and nails, your integumentary system. When I put all of your organ systems together, and do you know how many organ systems humans have? Close. No, less than 6. 11. 11. We have 11 organ systems, and when you put 11 organ systems together, for humans, you form an organism. And by definition, an organism is a single living thing. That's an organism. So a bacteria is an organism, but does it have 11 body systems? No. Not at all. So not everything has 11 body systems. We just happen to have 11. Okay? When I group a bunch of the same organisms, like you and I are the same organism. When there's a bunch of just one type of organism, what do we call that? A population. So a population is a group of the same organisms in that area. So you and I are a population right now. Are there any other populations in this room? Fantastic. There is another population in this room. There's bacteria. Are they part of our population? No, because by definition, a population is a group of the same organism. So there's a human population and there's a bacterial population. And you know what we call it when you put multiple populations together? Fantastic. A community. A community is a group of populations. Is your home a community? Yes. Because it's got humans. And then what's another population in your home? If you have animals. So it could be a dog population, a cat population, a fish population. I had someone last class say pigs. Pigs. I meant like in your home, but I'm cool with that too. Whatever. Okay? Got pigs in your house? That's cool. I don't know. All right? So what's the difference between a community, which is multiple populations, and an ecosystem?
An ecosystem has a lot of,
It does have a lot of communities.
as well as they share.
What's a physical environment? Like when you say the earth, get more specific. Your
House.
What about a house makes it the physical environment? Atmosphere is also part of the physical environment. What makes it physical environment?
The weather.
The weather is one of these aspects. You guys are all right. But what makes it part of the physical environment? What is it not? Living. Yes, it is not living. So an ecosystem is the community, the multiple populations, along with the non-living aspects, things that were never living. Like you said, the weather. Exactly. Your home. Your home was never alive. Right? This table, the chair, air, water, rocks, soil, sand, all of those things that were never alive make your community an ecosystem. Ecosystem has both living and non-living physical aspects. When I take all the ecosystems and I put them together, what do I form? What is a bio? Bio means what? Life. And what's a sphere? A three-dimensional circle. So what's the biosphere? The planet, the earth. Why don't we just call it Earth? Because we're scientists. So we say it's the biosphere. But down here I have that it's Earth. So do you need to be familiar with both? Yes. Yes, you do. You need to know that the biosphere is the Earth. So this is our hierarchy, our ranking system for all living organisms as far as how we group them. The diagram on the next slide shows us a step order sequence, starting with a cell, which is the basic unit of life. But then it jumps all the way to organism. Can you tell me what levels are missing? Tissue? Organ system. And then we get to our organism, and a group of organisms is and multiple populations, community, and community in the physical non-living aspects of the environment, and all the ecosystems, biosphere. Now, I asked you what I was missing here because that would be a basis for a really good test question. Okay? Like here I have this level and this level. What am I missing? Or how did I get there? So do you need to be familiar with the levels? Yes. Do you need to understand where they go as far as emergent properties are concerned? Yes. So a cell is a basic unit of life, but a group of cells working together forms a tissue. A group of tissues working together forms an organ. A group of organs working together form an organ system. Multiple organ systems working together create an organism. Multiple organisms create a population. Multiple populations and community. Populations and non-living physical aspects, an ecosystem, and all the ecosystems of the earth. Questions or clarification needed on that first characteristic one. Second characteristic, the information flow. And I asked you just a moment ago when we first did the intro, what is our chemical information? It's DNA. DNA is our chemical information. But it says information flow. There's two ways to look at that. First of all, how does our DNA flow when we're talking about a living organism? Through our blood. There is DNA in our blood. There's DNA in every cell in our life. But how come our DNA doesn't just end with us? What do you do to keep your DNA within that population? We don't have a cell wall. What do we do to keep our DNA within our population or within our species? We reproduce. So that information flows from parent to child or offspring and then continues on. That's one way to look at the way information flows. Before you leave this class this semester, there's a few things that I'm just set on you understanding. And one of those is that what DNA does. Because you will hear people say all the time, oh, it's in your genes. I ask people, why do I have blue eyes? Well, it's in your genes. You're right. But what does that mean? Well, it means it's in your DNA. Okay, well, your genes make up your DNA. Okay, yeah. But what does it mean? How did I get blue eyes? How did DNA, a piece of information, turn into blue eyes? I need you, before you leave me, to know how DNA works, what we even use it for. When you say it's in your genes, what does that mean? What do you mean it's in my genes? Obviously, you can see it, but what does it mean? DNA is our set amount of instructions that tells us what our body's going to look like, how our cells are going to function, how long they're going to live, where they're going to be located. Everything, information-wise, is stored in our DNA. But how does it go from one 6.5-foot piece of information to blue eyes and brown hair and bone and a heart? Ultimately, the process that you and I are going to study, I'm going to go to the next slide, and I'll come back to make sure I've covered these words, takes DNA, which most people can recognize. I can show them this molecule, and they're like, DNA. Okay, perfect. What about this molecule? It's clearly labeled RNA. Okay, but if you didn't know that, only usually a handful of students can recognize that and say that that's RNA. And then what is this structure here? It's a protein. Again, clearly labeled. And in college, when we give you a diagram, it's supposed to be informative. In high school, we use them as a distractor, which I think is jacked up, but still. In college, we want you to pull information from it. So this is a protein. But if I asked a kindergartner to recreate this protein, could they do it? Probably. They'll probably just draw a bunch of squigglies, right? But my question to you is this random? First key concept in biology. The only thing random in life are mutations and crossing over. The only thing random in life are mutations and crossing over. The only thing random in biology is mutations and crossing over. So a mutation is just a random change, and crossing over is when gametes are made. Gametes are your sperm and egg. A man in his entire life will never make two sperm that are the same, ever. And it's the same for a female. Her eggs, no two will ever be the same. Crossing over occurs when you make sperm or egg. Nothing in life besides those two are random or is random. So this shape right here is 100% intentional. Which brings me to my second biological keystone, and I will have like 5 this whole semester, and I'm introing 2 of them today. The second one is structure determines function. Structure determines function. The shape of something will determine what it has the ability to do. Shape or structure determines function. Example. If I take my truck key to my truck and I put it in my ignition, guess what my truck is going to do? It's going to start, right? Hopefully, right? If I have gas and the battery's good and all that, right? But when I get to the house and I go to let myself in the door, when I take my truck key to put it in the keyhole, what's going to happen? It's not going to work because that key is not the right shape, not the right structure. That key cannot carry out that function. Shape determines function, or structure determines function. You'll see those 2 used interchangeably, shape and structure. That determines function. If I change its shape, I will then change its function. 2 things that are random in life, mutations and crossing over. First, biological keystone. Second one, shape determines function. Shape determines function. So I'm going to go back, but real quick, before I say that, can anybody tell me just by using this diagram what we use DNA for? Analyze this diagram. It does store information, but based on this picture, say that again, protein. What about proteins? Okay, it is protein synthesis. When you say it's in my genes have the information to make what? Proteins. So this is like a spoiler alert. What is DNA used for? To make proteins. It has the information to make proteins. We call this process protein synthesis. Does anyone know what synthesis means? To make or to create. So protein synthesis means what? To create proteins. Why can't we just say we're making protein? Because we're scientists. And so we say we're undergoing protein synthesis, which you are doing right now, just so you know. Which is 100% also why when you walk into the doctor's office, they're like, well, it looks like you're suffering from subcutaneous hematoma. And you're like, what? Which is the long words for a bruise. That's just what we do. We talk really big so that nobody knows what we're talking about, right? You have to be smart to get it. So protein synthesis. I'm going to go back to this previous slide. We go from DNA. That DNA is copied into RNA, and that RNA is used to create a protein. So this right here in words is what the diagram shows you. I just wanted to make sure to make that connection before I move forward. Is there anyone who has a question about this concept? The second characteristic of living organisms or living systems is that they have a metabolism. They have a metabolism. And the term metabolism is a term that I've already said that most people, when I say metabolism, they're like digesting food, which is true. It's a metabolic function. But metabolism just means it's a series of chemical reactions. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to start kind of like, it's not a diagram, but it's like a reference tool that you will add to through the semester if you want to. You don't have to draw this at all. But I'm going to start it today because we will come back to metabolism over and over again. So here's the term metabolism. Okay? Now, let's say that you are trying to eat healthy and bulk up. So you say, I'm on a high-protein diet. So what are some foods that you potentially eat? Lots of chicken, lots of beef, lots of fish, shrimp. You're eating high-protein packed food, but here's the problem. Anything muscular, so when you eat another organism's muscle, it's full of protein. But whose protein is it? If I eat a chicken breast, which is the muscle in a chicken, what type of protein is in that chicken breast? Chicken protein. So you're eating the protein that the chicken made for itself. Is that going to work in Jessica? Why will that not work? I am not a chicken. That is 100% correct. I am not a chicken. Okay? So this takes us into, okay, well, I still eat it, and it's still good for me. True, but do you know why? When you break down your food, or what normal people call digest, and you shall no longer call it digestion. So break down. And I'm going to start here because that may be how you think of it right now, as breakdown. But there's a specific type of reaction that allows you to break down food, and it starts with a C. Does anyone know what it is? It's called a catabolic reaction. It's catabolic. And this doesn't only break down food. This breaks down anything. I'm just using your digestion example to help you parallel it. So we take in that chicken and we catabolize it. We break it down. And what I will teach you in chapter 3 is that when a protein is at its smallest, it's at what we call amino acids. So I've taken that chicken protein and I've torn it apart. My body has done that. Now that I have a bunch of amino acids, what do you think I'm going to do with those amino acids? I'm going to reposition them to make proteins for Jessica. Yeah. So I had to break them down into their basic units, and then I'm going to use them to build my own muscle. Does anybody have an idea what the opposite of catabolic is? Anabolic. Anabolic. And these are collectively called metabolic. So anabolic is building up. Catabolic is breaking down. Anabolic is building up. Catabolic is breaking down. And of course I'm using food for an example because you're familiar with this, but this deals with anything. When you talk about metabolism, this tiny skin cell right here has its own metabolism, where it carries out catabolic and anabolic reactions. Does this tiny cell here eat steak? No. If it did, I might be a lot larger. Okay? It does not, but it has its own metabolism. Every cell in our body has its own metabolism. Okay? So metabolic processes include catabolic and anabolic reactions. Catabolic to build or to break down, anabolic to build up. Two specific metabolic processes that we will study are photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And I want to just speak on the big picture of both of these real quick. Photosynthesis takes energy and turns it into food. Photosynthesis takes energy and turns it into food. Big picture. Photosynthesis takes energy and turns it into food. Cellular respiration does the exact opposite. It uses food and turns it into energy. Photosynthesis takes energy and turns it into food. Cellular respiration takes food and turns it into energy. Okay? Now, this diagram on the next slide reinforces this. Here's a sunflower. Because this is biology, I would love to use humans on every example, but that would be anatomy and physiology. So if you want to just study humans, roll with me in anatomy and physiology. But in biology, we have to study all life. So, hence the sunflower that's used here in this diagram. Also, the sunflower is clearly capable of conducting which of the previous processes that I just mentioned? Photosynthesis, which means it can take light energy and turn it into food. And then it will turn around and use that food to make energy. And when energy levels are low, it will receive energy from the sun in order to make food. And it will use that food to make energy. And then, do you see what's happening? It's a cycle. It's a metabolic cycle, a series of chemical reactions. Now, are you and I photosynthetic? No, it would be great if we were, right? Because we would have a whole lot more money. Right? If you just want your hamburger, you could just stand in the sun. Hamburger, Texas toast, mayonnaise instead of mustard. And be good. But we're not, unfortunately, right? We have to purchase our food. So since we can't make our own food, how do we do this step? We just eat food. Yeah. We just eat that number 7 from Waterbury on Texas toast. And that's our sugar. We break it down into sugar, and we use that food to make. And when our energy levels get low, guess what we do? We eat, and then we use that food to make. That's you, and me, and us all. Okay? So all living organisms carry out metabolic functions. We have a metabolism. And it's not just talking about digesting food, it's talking about everything that you do. All right? Questions or clarification on this concept? All right? The next characteristic of all living systems is that they take in energy, create energy, and release energy. And by create energy, I don't mean like from nothing. They're transforming energy, I should say that. So they take in energy and they release energy. They take energy in and they release energy. Do you remember what 3 letters represent energy? ATP. And we'll talk about that in more detail later on. Okay? But it's good to kind of start making these little notes so we can draw those connections as we move through the semester. The next bullet says that as a result of being living, you're going to be recycled. What do I mean? Yeah. You're going to die, okay? And then I had a few students say, well, I'm going to get put in a casket, and I'm not going to be part of the soil. Okay, you maybe not. Okay, whatever. But when your dog died, and you buried it out in the yard, what eventually happened to your dog? It decomposed, and the nutrients from your dog, the DNA, the sugars, the proteins, guess who's using them now? It was in the soil, and the soil used it to nourish plants, and then an organism ate the plants, and then another organism ate the organism that ate the plants, and now we have, it's called the circle of life. Okay? And even if you do get buried in your little casket and you never become part of the earth, whatever, you still poop right now. And you should every day at least once. Your life lesson. And if you don't, we'll drink more water. Anyways, your poop is waste to you, but it's a smorgasbord for who? Bacteria and fungi love it. And they will break it down, and the nutrients that are there will nourish the soil, that will feed it to the plants. And do you see where I'm going with this? We technically, that circle of life in biology is called the carbon cycle. But I put them both here so that you could see them together. So in order to be living, a characteristic of a living organism, you have to use and release energy, and you're going to be recycled. Questions or clarification on that concept? Okay? 5th characteristic of living systems is that they have to be able to compensate for change that happens outside of themselves. You have to be able to keep here homeostatic, here constant, regardless of what's happening out here. So, I walk into this lab, and I already know it's cold. As soon as I get in here, guess what I start doing? Shivering. What is the purpose of me shivering? Literally, it's going to create heat that's going to be funneled to my core to help keep my core warm. My fingers and toes will still be cold, but the purpose of shivering is to keep our core warm. And then after I have worked out for a really long time and I'm sweating, what is my body doing to help me maintain an internal balance? It's cooling itself down. That sweat is going to evaporate from my skin because of the heat. And as it evaporates, it pulls the heat with it. It's trying to maintain homeostasis, balance. Your body does pretty much everything for you without letting you know it needs help. The only time you know there's a problem is when your body cannot handle it. The only time you know there's a problem is when your body cannot handle it. Case in point, if you have a headache, that's because your body is telling you, I have tried to maintain homeostasis, but whatever it is something I cannot control. What are some reasons you might have a headache? Dehydration. Can my body create water? No, so it's telling me to do what? I need you to drink water. We are dehydrated. You're in pain. You're feeling this. Drink some water. What's another reason you might get a headache? Stress. Is stress an internal thing? Okay, it is, because you've created it with your mind, but what has caused that stress? Something external. Whether it's financial status, kids, school, your biology teacher, whatever it is. Your body will try to maintain a level of constancy while you're under that stress, but if it can't, it'll let you know. Hey, especially if it's chronic or long-term. What if you have a headache because you're hungry? Can you create food? No, we just talked about that. You have to eat, and then that headache will go away. Your body will tell you when it can't control itself, when it can't fix it. We call that negative feedback. When there's a problem, your body makes you aware of it, and what do? You stop it, you fix it. Negative feedback. When my temperature it drops because I'm cold, my body says, that's not okay. I start shivering so that I do what? I warm up. Right. I maintain homeostasis. That's negative feedback. I was told there was a problem and my body fixed it. Real life example. Some of you have kids and some of you, this was you, or you have younger siblings. But remember when you had that planner in elementary school or that folder that every afternoon your teacher would do the smiley face stamp or, a sticker or whatever she did, or he. And what were you supposed to do with that planner? You're supposed to take it home to who? You show it to your parents. And if you got a happy face, you showed it to your parents and they were like, that's awesome. Keep up the good work. Your parents had to sign it, and then what did you do with it? Took it back to your teacher so that the next day the teacher could communicate. This was that communication tool, that feedback tool. Well, you always know when you had a smiley face because you came home happy, nothing was going to happen. But I know when Z gets his planner signed. Because when he gets in the truck, what's he like? When he gets it signed, or when he gets a red face, or a red light, or a yellow light, he gets in the truck and he's like, hey, Mom. Hey, boy, how's your day? What's wrong, nothing? Oh. All right. Can I see your planner? I'm like, okay, did you get your planner signed today? Yeah. And he starts crying. Okay, so why did you get your planner signed? And the teacher's already written a note. And I'm the type of parent, if you tell me the truth, you're not in trouble. If you tell me, no, I didn't murder them, and you did, I'm supposed to have your back. I'm like, no, she knows she can't lie. She said she didn't do it, she didn't do it. But if my daughter was like, hey, I knocked her off. Okay, thank you, sweetheart, for being honest with me. Now we can work forward and try to solve this. Okay. But he says, yeah, I hit Mason in the face today. Oh, okay. Why'd you hit Mason in the face? Well, Mason made me mad. He said something that really upset me. Okay. Was that the right thing to do? No. Okay. So what are you going to do in the future? I'll tell my teacher. Okay. That sounds like a good plan. Thank you, Miss LeBeau, for letting me know Isaiah hit Mason in the face today and handling it at school. I have now addressed it at home. He should not hit Mason in the face today, or tomorrow, or ever again. He knows that that's not acceptable, and we've talked about what to do. So she sent a message to me telling me there was a problem. I addressed it on our end, and it went back to the school. Thank you for letting me know. Okay, you should not experience this again. That's negative feedback. You're aware of a problem, you address the problem, and the problem is resolved. Okay? Positive feedback, on the other hand, it becomes tricky for students because you think it's positive feedback, so you think it's something good. Positive feedback is a type of feedback that gets worse and worse and worse. It's amplified until something physically stops it. Something physically stops it. Two really good examples, I'm going to use one. When a woman has a baby. Does anyone know how long a woman can be in labor before she actually delivers a child? Days. Like 3 weeks. She can start having contractions. And then they're not always as extreme, but let me explain the sequence of events. When the baby's lungs are fully developed, it will send a signal to the mother's brain that says that that baby is ready to be born. That's how a baby's birth date is determined. So the baby's ready. It sends a signal to the mother's brain that says this baby's ready, and the mother's brain says, okay, let's get it out. So she releases a hormone from her posterior pituitary called oxytocin. Oxytocin then travels through her blood, and it takes a while, to her uterus. And when it gets to her uterus is told to squeeze. And she does that. And so she has a contraction, and she kind of stops for a minute, and she's like, what? Because that's probably her first contraction. It's not like in the movies where all of a sudden she's like in full labor, the baby like slides out. That's not a thing. Anyways, so a message, after the uterus squeezes one time, a message is sent back to the brain that said, wait, you told me to get rid of the baby. I squeezed, the baby didn't come out. And the brain said, no problem. We'll send more power. So instead of 1 dose of oxytocin, it sends 2. So that oxytocin then travels. And because it's through your blood, it can take a while. So she may have her first contraction, and the next one might not show up for another few hours. Right? So the second contraction comes, it squeezes with twice as much power, and it goes back to the brain and said, that baby is still there. And this series goes on over and over and over. And every time the message gets sent back to the mother's brain that said that baby is still there, the brain is shoveling more oxytocin out until the oxytocin levels in her blood are so high that her contractions are so powerful that that baby has no choice but to leave her body. The problem got worse and worse and worse until what happened? She physically delivered that baby. That baby was removed. That's positive feedback. Another example for that would be blood clotting, but I'm not going to go through that one, but that's another example that's used in your textbook. So you're able to maintain homeostasis. Did that baby need to leave the mother's body? Yes. What would happen if the baby stayed? Yeah. It would grow really large, and it would probably do what? It would probably expire. Because the mom wouldn't have enough nutrients to nourish that baby much longer. And what would happen to the mother when the baby expired? She would expire. So the baby had to go. It was either him or me. Okay? Next characteristic of living organisms is that they reproduce and they develop. So again, of course, I already mentioned, but when I say reproduction, everybody's like sexual reproduction. You are very right. But there are other types of reproduction. Of course, there's asexual, which means you just have one parent. And because in biology we do discuss all living organisms, there are situations where you just have one parent. Okay, like an earthworm, like a sponge, those are just one parent. You don't need two. But you also reproduce at the cellular level. Like right now, you're making cells to replace the skin cells that you're losing right now. And have you always been this size? No. If you were born this size, your mother is probably no longer with us. You were born tiny so that she could get rid of you. And when your grandma pinches your cheeks and says, "How did you get so big?" Mitosis. That's literally what happens. Your cells reproduce, and guess what you start to do? You grow and develop so that you can do what? Reproduce. Yeah. And then you'll reproduce and you'll have babies and your babies will be small. And then you'll look at them one day and be like, how did you get to be this big? But you already know the answer because we hung out during the fall of 2019. And you're like, mitosis. My baby's growing because of mitosis. Be proud. Okay? So, living organisms have to be able to grow, develop, and then ultimately reproduce. If they stop reproducing, what happens to that species? It goes extinct, yes. Okay? Questions on that concept? Seventh and final characteristic of living organisms is the ability to evolve. When we say evolution, there are different ways to look at evolution. You and I are going to study biological evolution because we're in biology, yes. So the key point that I want to emphasize right now is that when we talk about biological evolution, it always has something to do with genetics. What's genetics? Your makeup? What's genetics? Your genes, your DNA. Let's get comfortable. If it's genes, it's genetics. I told you. Like, I'll have the idea. I just can't. If it's genes, genes are DNA. Like, if you see a question that's asking about DNA, then that's also meaning genes. If it says genetic material, that's also your DNA, which is your genes. Like, we can use all these terms and make them work, okay? So when biological evolution is discussed and we're talking about genetic changes, what's changing? DNA. And the reason why it has to be DNA is because if it's changing in my DNA, guess who I'm going to pass it on to? My offspring. If it doesn't occur in my DNA, my kid's not going to get it. If I leave class today, get in an accident and lose my right arm, and then in 2 years decide I will have kid number 5, will my kid have a chance of being born with one arm? No. I had changed, yeah, but was it genetic? No. If I was born with one arm, would there be a possibility that my child could potentially inherit that? Yes. Okay? Yes. There's a difference. So in biology, everything is always going to tie back to DNA. It's some way or another, you're going to be able to squiggle in some DNA. Okay? When we talk about, those were the 7 characteristics. The second section of this text is biological evolution, which just expounds upon point 7. So that's why I have it underlined here. So biological evolution, how do we know about it? Charles Darwin. And I love to give you the history of scientists, and I will when we get to this place within the semester. But chapter 1 serves as a survey chapter, so we're basically just barely touching on each topic we're going to cover. Okay? So I'm introducing everything to you in this chapter, and then we're going to come back and go into details. All right? So Charles Darwin, I'm going to truncate that version. He sailed on a ship for 5 years, came back, married his cousin, had 10 kids, lived in a really large house because his family was very wealthy, his parents. And he wrote about how he noticed organisms were changing over time. But he had to hide all of his work. Why did he hide his work? At that point, the church was the know-all, say-all. And what he was saying was going against the church. And he knew that if he said that out loud, who would suffer? His family. His wife and kids would reap crazy, chaotic criticisms because of his studies. He protected them for a very long time until pride got in the way. These gentlemen. Darwin had over 20 volumes of research. And we know that because he published them. He was going to keep that all on the down low until Alfred Wallace, which very few people know of, which was one of his colleagues/cohorts. Like, they studied and kind of bounced information back on each other. But how do you become famous in science? By discovering it. And you have to be the first to discover it. Does that make sense? You have to be the first, because if you come in afterwards, nobody knows you. Well, Alfred Wallace was like, I'm going to let everybody know. And Darwin said, me first. And who do we know? Charles Darwin. And unless you had a really awesome, and there's a lot behind that story, a really awesome high school instructor that went through that, or you just personally studied that, there's a lot you don't know, and you may not even heard of Alfred Wallace. But he is brought up in our college text. Ultimately, these two gentlemen collectively came to the conclusion that populations of organisms change through time. Is the word genetic in that definition there? Populations of organisms change through time. Is genetics in that? The word genetics is here. Guess what they didn't know about? They had no idea. Do you know, in my life, I'm 37. When I was a freshman in high school, they sequenced the genome for humans. We haven't known about DNA for millions of years. We've known about DNA for like 25. Seriously. Like within many of your lifetime, that's how we've known about what DNA can do and what it's capable of, and it's fun. We barely know this. This is all new science. That's why they're going back and solving cold cases, because we didn't even have that in the 80s. Early 90s, no. We just barely knew. Okay? They had no idea. They knew something was changing, but they didn't know why it was changing. They just documented that change. In fact, they didn't say genetics, they said characters. We noticed things like the fur or the feathers are changing. They didn't know that that was something genetically determined. A mutation, what does the word mutation mean? Change. It's just change. Mutation is a fancy word for change. But are you going to see the word change in your test? No, it's going to say mutation. Mutations are random. And these random mutations, whenever I say mutation, most of the time people think cancer. They're like, oh, it's something bad. But are all mutations bad? No. And if your mutation is good, guess what you're going to do when you reproduce? You're going to pass it on to your kiddo. And your kiddo will have that good mutation. And eventually, when it becomes more prevalent in your population, it becomes an adaptation. So mutations lead to adaptations. Adaptations lead to evolution. So it goes mutation, adaptation, adaptations lead to evolution. Mutations turn into adaptations if they're beneficial, and those adaptations eventually transform into evolution. So let's talk about that in a more specific context, natural selection or survival of the fittest. We've already said that our whole purpose in life is to reproduce. But what does it mean to be fit? Survival of the fittest. What is that? You're strong. Okay, what else? You're intelligent. What else? You're big. You're strategic. Your genes. Okay? So, are there some super, super strong people that don't know how to think very well? Yeah. And are there some really, really smart people who aren't very strong? So why are they still around? If our definition of fitness is that you should have strength and mind capacity, they are able to survive long enough to do what? Reproduce. That's our goal. You're considered fit if you can survive long enough to reproduce. If you can maintain in your environment long enough to pass your characteristics on, you've been successful. You are fit. Because the fact you've survived means that your characteristics are good. Your genes are good. Whether they're because you're smart or because you're strong or because you're resourceful. You know how to take things that most people can't use and utilize them. That could be fitness. Fitness is a lot of different things. But if you can survive long enough to reproduce, in biology's terms, we say you are fit. You have two choices. We call this natural selection. And in biology, you always have two choices. We just kind of rename them. For natural selection, you are either selected for or you're selected against. If you are selected for, you survive long enough to reproduce. If you are selected against, you don't. If you're selected against, you don't. And if I put this in human terms, and I've said this before, and you'll hear me say, people get really upset, like your feelings are right here. And so I'm going to use rabbits right now until our relationship is stronger, and I can talk about humans and you not get upset at me. But why do rabbits have so many babies? Why is their life expectancy shorter? In our area here, I don't care if you're in that nice little housing addition or whatever, there's coyotes, there's dogs. So if that litter has 15 rabbits, let's say 9 of them get picked off by a coyote. Okay, so that leaves 6. Yikes. So 9 have already been selected against. They're dead. They can't reproduce. That was natural. What happens when that rabbit crosses the road in front of your vehicle? Selected against. Did not survive long enough to reproduce. Do you see where I'm going with this? And why people are like, oh my gosh, are you telling me I've been selected against? Maybe. So the reason they have so many offspring is because a lot of them are going to die, or they won't survive, or do not have the ability to reproduce. So they've been selected against. If you survive long enough to reproduce, you have been selected for, and you are considered fit. And that is why it's called survival of the fittest. My next question is, how do we measure your fitness? How do we know how fit you are? You've reproduced, but how fit are you? What about your offspring?
Their genetics.
Because you've passed them yours to them, so they have good genes, hopefully. How do you measure my fitness? Your fitness? The mother's fitness of those rabbits, or the father's fitness of those rabbits. How do you measure that? How many you have. The more offspring you have, the more fit you are. Now that doesn't include, so mom had 15 rabbits, and we know that 12 of them got knocked off. She still had 15 rabbits. Does that make sense? So her fitness is measured at 15. Your fitness level is measured by the number of offspring you have. Okay, so the more fit you are, the more you'll reproduce. For humans, our batch size or clutch size is really small because we're intimate with our kids. We take care of them for a long time. But how long do rabbits take care of their babies?
6 months.
Yeah, not long. They're like, hey, scurry on. Babies are coming out. You need to move on. You're another mouth to feed, and I can't do it. And they get hit by a car, and you're like, oh, selected against. Okay. So, whenever those organisms are selected for, and they survive long enough to reproduce, and those traits are passed on, where are those traits stored? In their DNA. It's always going to come back to DNA, which is your genes, which is your genetic material. Okay? And that's what this right here kind of summarizes. Okay? Heredity. On this right here, there is something that I do want to point out. I want to use this slide. So heredity is talking about your ability to pass characteristics on from parent to offspring. But what's the difference between a gene and DNA? Because DNA has your genes, and genes are in your DNA. Okay? What am I drawing right here? Right, we could play Pictionary. Everybody would get this. Everyone can always tell me that's DNA. And that you are correct. Okay? Now, where are the genes? Okay, codons give us the code for amino acids, which you are correct. Where are the genes right here? The branches in the middle. And that's what everyone thinks. Today, we will learn something new. And you will walk out of here more intelligent. A gene is an entire segment of DNA. So, right here might be my I gene. And down here, this might be my heart gene. And do you remember what we use DNA for? We said this a few slides ago. To make proteins. So this I gene gives me the information to make what? I proteins. When they say it's in your genes, that's true. But you have over 22,000 genes. And one cell has over 6.5 feet of genetic material in every cell in your body. And at the end of the semester, we do DNA extraction. You'll be able to hold your own DNA in your hand. But cool. So a gene, by definition, is just a segment of DNA. A gene, by definition, is just a segment of DNA. So I wanted you to see that relationship. So when you say it's in my DNA, yeah, you are 100% correct. Or it's in my genes, yeah. But now you know the difference between it just being in my DNA and it's my gene. I have a gene for that. Because you have a gene for both characters that you inherited from your parents. My dad has brown eyes. My mom has blue eyes. Did I get a gene for brown and blue? We'll talk about this later. But let's say that I did. Which one is turned on? The blue. Which one is turned off? The brown. So I carry that. And technically, just so that we're on the same page, that's my hot point. We're on the same page. My dad doesn't have brown eyes. My mom does have blue eyes. But the only way to get blue eyes is if they had two recessive traits. Okay? But for my kids, my husband has brown eyes. I have blue eyes. All of my kids have brown eyes. Every single one of them. But do they carry the gene for blue? So I have hope for my grandkids. Okay? I have hope for my grandkids. Because you have 2 copies of each gene, but one of them is turned off. So when we talk about my I gene, technically I have 2. One from mom and one from dad. Just one of them has been turned off. Okay? So when you say it's in my genes, I have 2 eye genes, I have 2 skin genes, I have 2 hair genes, 2 bone. You have everything, 2 copies of those, because you receive one from mom and one from your dad. Okay? All right. Mutations, you know, are changes, and where do those changes have to occur? In your DNA, in order to be passed down. And these mutations, even though mutations are random, they increase what we call genetic variability. What does that mean, genetic variability? Different kinds of genes, the chances of getting blue and brown eyes. Why do every sperm and every egg have to be different? So that we're not all the same, 100%. So why is variation important? Why is it important that we're different? Okay, it could take longer, so we all don't look like robots. If we were all the same, if you were the same as me, we would all be females. First problem. Second, if I got cancer, so my question again is, why is it beneficial for us to all be different? It increases your chances of surviving long enough to do what? Reproduce. And that's how you become fit. And we measure your fitness by the number of offspring that you have. Do you see how this is all just kind of... It's life. Life hasn't changed since the beginning of life. We're just trying to make it all make sense. Those mutations, which are random changes that allow for variation, eventually turn into adaptations. For example, what color are the moths that you see now? Do we have white moths? We have grayish, brownish moths. Now, does anybody know what color moths were in the 20s? White. What's the big difference between now and the 20s? Not birds. The environment, the pollution. My trees before all of these industrial plants opened and started releasing their waste into the atmosphere, my trees were a lighter color. So when a white moth landed on that light colored tree, it was camouflaged. Birds couldn't see it. But then the Industrial Revolution occurred. We have a whole bunch of large factories. A lot of smog and pollution is released. And guess where all of that pollution goes? Get ready, because trees take in the carbon dioxide because they use it to release oxygen. That's what they do. That's photosynthesis. So they're taking all of that in, and what slowly happens to the colors of these trees because they're taking in all of this trash? They get darker. So you're a light moth on a dark background, and what happens? You get picked off. You're easily spotted. So here's what happens. You have a bunch of white moths dying, and they're still trying to reproduce. They keep their population up. But a pair of white parents had a black and white baby. And the moth community was so shocked. What was she doing? But guess what happened to that black and white baby? It wasn't mutation. It was completely random. It survived. And because it was capable of surviving, it was later able to do what? And guess what its kids look like? Black and white. We call them peppered moths. And they were incredibly successful. So we saw the number of peppered moths increase because this random mutation turned out to be a beneficial mutation and eventually became an adaptation. So white moths decreased. But the pollution levels continued to increase. And guess what started happening to our peppered moths? They started getting picked off because the trees got darker and darker and you could still spot that white part. So 2 peppered moths, many years later, have babies and one of them comes out gray. Everybody's talking about him. But guess what happened to that gray baby? He survived long enough to do what? Reproduce. Now, can you tell me what you do right now when you see a white moth? You get freaked out. What do you do? What's going to happen to that white moth? It's about to die. You're about to kill it. True or false? Okay, and if not, then you're, okay, whatever. But you totally missed the black moth on the wall behind you. Why? Because you couldn't see him. That white moth stuck out. It was easy for you to spot, easy for you to kill. That black moth is like, I'm right here watching this whole thing take place. That was a mutation that turned into an adaptation that eventually led to an evolution of a population. We went from having white moths to grayish and brown moths now. Okay? Please read this slide to yourself and tell me what this means. Diversity of life on Earth is produced by accumulation of adaptations and other genetic differences between populations over long spans of time. This is evolution. Here's what I need you to understand. When I explain it to you, everybody's like, I get it. This makes sense. But the way I say it isn't the way it's on the test. You still have to be able to read it and pick out the aspects that tell you this is evolution. So I have capitalized those words. Adaptations, genetic, population, time. Do you see what I'm saying? My number one complaint after test number 1 is, in class I get it. It makes sense when you say it. But you can't read the test. You don't get what the test question is saying. So if we know that's a problem, let's figure it out right now so that it's not a problem. Okay, yes, you are 100% correct. This is evolution. Okay, last topic for today, and then we will stop, is biodiversity. What is bio again? Life. And diversity means? Different. Yeah, we're different life, a varied life. We take, and it talks about the tree of life and us having a common ancestor. Does anyone have any idea who our common ancestor is? Okay, that's for humans, but for all life. It's a prokaryote. What's the only thing on Earth that's prokaryote? A bacteria. You're great. great-grandparents were just bacteria. That's humbling, huh? To think that you just came from bacteria. What? And also, just so you and I are on the same page, the first form of life in any situation has to be bacteria. So when they're like, we found life on Mars, you and I, uneducated people, are like, oh my gosh, there's aliens in shopping malls. No, there's not. There's just bacteria. Okay? There's just bacteria. And in order for the bacteria will eventually lead to protists like amoeba, and amoebas, then it'll take a long time. There's not aliens driving sports cars. Okay? So that's just sci-fi that's making us think that. The science of classifying all life is called taxonomy. Taxonomy is the classification of living organisms. Taxonomy is a classification. A species, by definition, is a group of organisms that are capable of successfully interbreeding. What this means is, if you're the same species, you can have a baby and your babies can have babies. So like we're humans in here. We can reproduce with each other and our babies can reproduce because we're the same species. But what happens when a lion and tiger reproduce? They create a baby, a liger, but a liger is sterile. A liger cannot reproduce. We see the same thing happening when a horse and a donkey reproduce. They're not the same species. They create a mule, but the mule is sterile. It itself cannot reproduce. So they're not the same species. This is 100% also why we don't have cogs, cat dogs. Have dogs and cats engaged in intercourse? I'm sure. But have they been successful? No. No. Okay, there's some weird stuff that takes place. But nature has a way of selecting against those offspring. Okay? So you're considered a species when you can successfully reproduce, which means you can have the baby and the baby can have babies. Okay? We can take all living organisms and classify them into 3 domains, into 6 kingdoms. So the science of classification is taxonomy. Who discovered this taxonomy or this classification system? His name was Carlos Linné. And this system is called binomial nomenclature. A lot of people see that term and they're like, what? But this is where dissecting the words does nothing but benefit you. What does bi mean? 2. And nome means name. So 2 named ranking system or classifying system or grouping system. So 2 named naming system. We're putting them in groups and we're giving them 2 names. Here is the levels that we organize living organisms in. This is different from cells, tissues, organs. So those are the biological levels of organization. This is taxonomy, the classification of those living organisms. We have 8 major categories, and then I have taxons in blue. Taxons is the term you'll probably see, and right in parentheses next to it, I have the word levels, because that's what taxons are, levels. And I don't want you to be like, I don't know what a taxon is. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. It's a level. So I started here with the largest one, domain. And out beside these, I added terms to make it more specific. Domain is most inclusive. What does that mean? It includes everything. It's most inclusive. That could also be stated by saying it is the least exclusive, which means what? It doesn't leave anything out. So if it's inclusive, it includes everything. Exclusive, it leaves it out. And if it's not exclusive, that means it leaves nothing out. I just want you to see how it may be written so that there's no tricking you when you see it on a test. A domain is very general. Everything kind of fits in. Those domains can be broken down into kingdoms. Those kingdoms can be then broken down further into phyla or divisions if we're talking about plants. And the only reason it's those 2 is because when we first started classifying organisms, you were either a plant or animal. Okay? So no disrespect to anything else. That's what it is. Lower than a phyla is a class, order, family. And notice how on genus and species I have them in italics. That is completely intentional. The genus and species should also always be written in italics. Okay? And the species I have here are least inclusive. What does that mean? Very specific. Only certain things fit in there. When you say Homo sapien, what should I see? A human. A Homo sapien is a human. That's it. If I have a dog, is that a Homo sapien? No. It's very specific. Very specific. Here's our classification for you and I. We are in the domain Eukarya. We are in the kingdom Animalia because we're animals. Eukarya means that we have eukaryotic cells. We are in the phylum Chordata, which means that we have a spinal cord. We are in the class Vertebrata, which means that we have a vertebral column, a backbone. We are in the order Mammalia because we have hair and mammary glands. We fall into the primates because we have opposable thumbs. We could be quadra or bipedal, depending. Genus Hominidae, which means that we have the ability to balance and walk on two. Species, sapiens. Genus and species, again, are both written in italics. Everything else can be normal. Italics. Okay? Genus is always capitalized. Species is always lowercase. So here's our name in binomial nomenclature. Homo sapien. On the next slide, I show you an example, not using a human, but using a dog to kind of put it pictorially in your brain. We go from being very inclusive to very exclusive. When you say domain eukarya, anything eukaryotic fits there. Kingdom Animalia, only animals. Phylum Chordata, spinal cord. It gets smaller and smaller until we get down to the Canis familiaris, which is our normal domesticated dog. It's not just the Dalmatian. We're just using that picture there. Okay? So it went from very inclusive to very exclusive. Questions on that? Okay? Do you have to know the levels, the names, domain, king? Yes, you have to know them in order. So this is the sentence I've used since 8th grade when I had to learn these initially. Darn, Ken poured coffee on Fred's good shirt. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Well, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. A question on the test may say, you have a class, order, species, and phyla. Which one is most inclusive? Class, order, species, and phyla. Which one is most inclusive? Most inclusive. I have class, class, order, species, and phyla. Which one is most inclusive? Phyla. Phyla. So it may not have domain and kingdom. You need to be able to say whichever one ranks the highest. Or does that make sense? So do you need to know the order? The answer is yes. Remember, the groups get smaller as you go. Kingdoms are most inclusive. Species are least inclusive or most exclusive. Our scientific name is always made up of the genus and species. Homo sapiens. Genus is capitalized, species is lowercase. Always written in italics. Here are the rules for writing something in binomial nomenclature. So everything I've said verbally is now put in writing. We always have it written in italics, capital, lowercase. We run into a problem now, and we have for the last few years, because we have a group of individuals who were not taught to write cursive. Because if you can't write in italics, they say, okay, write it in cursive. It was just mandated last year that we have to start teaching cursive again. They had stopped teaching cursive. So now we have a whole group of individuals, it's going to be back-to-back years, who don't know how to read or write in cursive. True statement. My daughter brought home a card the other day from her coach. It was written in cursive. She said, I can't read this. She is 14. I said, I have failed you. We need to work on that. So we have a situation where we can't write in italics, we can't write sideways, we can't write cursive. So the option, write normal, but you underline it. So if it's in scientific notation or binomial nomenclature, it's either underlined or italicized. Genus is always capitalized, species is always lowercase. So the first word, and it tells you that there. This makes science a universal language. What does universal mean? I can use it all over anywhere. True story. In Texas, we have a silver bug that when you touch it, it rolls up into a ball. What is that bug? A roly-poly. Everybody knows that. It's roly because it rolls up, and it's poly because poly rhymes with roly. Duh. Right? When you say roly-poly to somebody in Texas, they're like, I know what you're talking about. In northern states, specifically Michigan, guess what they call it? A pill bug. That's stupid. What? Anyways, so people in Texas are like, and people in Michigan are like, roly-poly is stupid. We're like, okay, anyways, here's the problem. In Texas and in Michigan, they were both studying roly-polies in their preferred habitat, which is in the dark, in a moist environment, usually cool, under a rock type of setting. Both of them are studying the same organism and don't know why. Don't know what each other is doing because they call it something different. It is now required and has been for many years that if you call it a roly-poly, right next to it you have to have its name scientifically noted. So, because how do we get research now? If I want to know something about a roly-poly, guess what I do? Internet. I Google it. And its scientific name has to pop up. And whenever I search by that scientific name, no matter where you are, it tells you what they refer to it as, and it makes sense. It's the same thing whether you speak French, Spanish, German, Japanese, or English, or any other language for that matter. It's universal. So binomial nomenclature is a universal scientific language for naming living organisms, classifying living organisms. Questions on anything we've covered today? Okay, this is where we will stop. It is